There is something about a palace that most people never get to see. The cameras catch the waving, the uniforms, the golden carriages, and the perfectly pressed suits. But behind those heavy doors, behind the marble walls, and the long silent corridors, there's a life that nobody talks about. A life that is lonelier than anyone would ever dare to admit out loud. And inside that life, sometimes the most unexpected friendship quietly takes root. This is not a story about crowns. This is not a story about power. This is a story about a boy who had everything the world could offer and still felt completely alone. And it is equally the story of a man who stood outside a door every single day, a man nobody really noticed, a man whose job was to be invisible, and yet somehow he became the most important presence in a young prince's world. The year was not too long ago. The palace was alive with noise. Advisors moving quickly through the halls, staff members with clipboards, security details checking rooms, maids adjusting curtains that were already perfectly straight. Routine ruled everything. Every hour had a purpose. Every movement had a reason. And right in the middle of all this controlled, organized, scheduled life, there was a child who did not quite fit. Prince Edward, not his real name, as royal families guard their private lives carefully, was 9 years old when this story truly began. He was the kind of boy who asked too many questions, laughed too loudly for a royal dining room, and had a habit of leaving his books open on the floor instead of placing them back on the shelf. His tutors were patient but firm. His household staff were kind but always professional. His parents loved him deeply, but they were busy in the way that royals are always busy, with duties, with travel, with responsibilities that do not pause for bedtime stories or afternoon games. Edward had everything. His room was bigger than most people's homes. His toys were crafted by the finest makers in the country. He had access to private gardens, personal chefs, and a library that would make most universities jealous. But the one thing he did not have, the one thing that no amount of royal privilege could buy, was someone who just talked to him like a normal human being. And then there was James. James was 34 years old and had been a palace guard for nearly 8 years by the time he was assigned to the corridor outside the young prince's private quarters. He was not the most decorated guard. He had not come from a long line of soldiers or a prestigious military academy. He had grown up in a small town, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher, and he had joined the Royal Guard because he believed in something, in duty, in discipline, in showing up and doing the right thing even when no one was watching. His posting outside the prince's corridor was considered by many of his colleagues to be one of the quieter assignments. Stand, watch, stay alert, report anything unusual. That was the job. Simple, quiet, invisible. James was good at invisible. The first time Edward spoke to him, it was completely by accident. It was a Tuesday evening, and Edward had slipped out of his room just after 9 o'clock because he had forgotten his favorite book in the sitting room down the hall. He was moving quickly, barefoot on the cold marble floor, wearing pajamas covered in small blue planets, and he nearly walked directly into James, who was standing exactly where he was supposed to be standing, still as a statue, eyes forward. Edward stopped, looked up. James looked straight ahead. "You're always out here," Edward said. James did not respond. "Protocol." Edward tilted his head. "Don't you get bored?" James kept his eyes forward. But something about the question, the genuine curiosity in it, the complete absence of any royal performance, made the corner of his mouth twitch, just slightly. "I'm on duty, Your Highness," James said, his voice perfectly even. Edward stared at him for another 3 seconds. Then he nodded, as if that was a completely satisfying answer, grabbed his book from the sitting room, and padded back to his room. James heard the door click shut. He exhaled slowly. That was it. That was the whole conversation. But it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, the encounters became a quiet pattern. Edward would appear in the corridor at odd hours, too early in the morning, too late at night, always with some reason that was barely convincing. He needed water. He had a question for his tutor that could absolutely wait until morning. He thought he heard noise, and each time he would stop for a moment near James and say something. A small thing, a simple thing, a question or an observation that had clearly been sitting in his head with nowhere to go. "Do you think fish know they're in water?" Edward asked one night. James, staring straight ahead, allowed himself a brief pause. "I think they don't know anything else, so probably not." Edward considered this. "That's kind of sad, or it's kind of peaceful," James said. Edward went back to his room. But the next night, he was back again, standing in the corridor with his arms folded across his chest like a small professor preparing a lecture. "I thought about what you said. About the fish. I think you're right. If you don't know anything else exists, you can't miss it. So maybe ignorance is actually a gift sometimes." James blinked. He was standing in front of a 9-year-old who had just casually delivered a philosophical observation that most adults wouldn't reach until their 30s. "That's a very deep thought, Your Highness," he said carefully. "I have them sometimes," Edward replied, completely seriously, and went back to his room. The senior staff noticed nothing unusual. From their perspective, the guard was doing his job, and the prince was simply passing through the corridor occasionally, as children do. There was no rule being broken. There was no cause for concern. What no one fully understood yet was that something invisible and important was building in that corridor, slowly, quietly, the way the most real things in life always build. James began to look forward to those brief conversations in a way he didn't fully admit to himself at first. His days were long and quiet. Standing in place for hours requires a particular kind of mental discipline, a way of being present while also staying very still inside your own head. Most guards learn to simply turn off the thinking and exist in a kind of professional blankness. James had always been good at that. But now, somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a small window of anticipation, a wondering about what the young prince would say next. Because Edward always said something worth hearing. One morning, just after 6 o'clock, when the palace was barely awake and the light through the corridor windows was still gray and thin, Edward appeared at his doorway, wrapped in a blanket like a small ghost. He sat down on the floor right there in the corridor, his back against the wall, and opened a book. James looked at him, then looked forward again. "You can read," Edward said without looking up. "It doesn't bother me. I'm on duty, Your Highness." Standing and reading at the same time seems like it would make the time go faster. It would, James admitted, but it's not allowed. Edward thought about this. That seems like a rule made by someone who never had to stand in one place for 8 hours. James said nothing, but internally he agreed completely. They sat there together in the quiet morning, one standing, one sitting on the floor wrapped in a blanket, and said nothing more for a long while. And somehow that silence was its own kind of conversation. It was comfortable. It was easy. It was the kind of quiet that only exists between people who don't need to perform for each other. That morning was the first time James understood that this was not just a child looking for attention. This was a boy who was genuinely, deeply lonely, and who had somehow decided, without any ceremony or announcement, that James was safe. Being chosen as safe by someone who had every reason to trust no one is not a small thing. James knew that. He felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as something he wanted to honor carefully. Because in a palace full of people whose job was to serve the prince, James had become something rarer, someone the prince actually wanted to be around. And that quietly and without any fanfare changed everything. In the weeks that followed, the conversations grew longer, though never inappropriate, never crossing the careful line that James always kept clearly in his mind. He was a guard. Edward was a prince. That boundary existed for good reasons, and James respected it completely. But within that boundary, there was room for something real, for honest exchange, for questions answered truthfully, for a young boy to feel that at least one person in his enormous, orchestrated life was not playing a role. Edward began telling James things. Small things at first, that he didn't like his history tutor's habit of sighing heavily whenever Edward got a date wrong, that he secretly thought the palace horses were more interesting than most of the adults he had to have dinner with, that he sometimes stood at his window at night and wondered what it would feel like to just walk out onto an ordinary street and buy something from a shop with his own money, like a regular person. James listened. He did not offer unnecessary advice. He did not try to fix or redirect or gently steer the prince toward more appropriate thoughts. He just listened, fully, quietly, honestly, and occasionally, when Edward asked him a direct question, James answered it directly. Not with palace-approved language, not with careful diplomatic softening, but with plain, honest words. It was the plain honesty that Edward had been starving for. By the time autumn arrived and the leaves in the palace gardens had turned gold and red, the corridor outside Edward's room had become something more than a post. It had become, for a lonely young prince, the one place in the entire palace where he felt completely himself. And for a quiet, steady guard from a small town, it had become the most meaningful assignment of his life, though he would not have said that out loud to anyone. Not yet. Winter came to the palace the way it always did, slowly, then all at once. The gardens went bare. The heating system inside the great stone walls hummed constantly. Staff members moved through the corridors in slightly heavier clothing, and the mornings turned dark and slow. But in the corridor outside Prince Edward's room, the quiet rhythm that had been building since autumn continued without interruption, steady and warm in its own invisible way. Edward was 10 now. His birthday had come and gone, a formal event with carefully selected guests, a cake that was more architecture than food, and speeches from people he barely knew who called him the future of the nation and shook his hand with 2 hands the way adults do when they want to seem serious. He had smiled and stood straight and said thank you the correct number of times. He had performed the whole day perfectly. That night, he had appeared in the corridor at 10:30, sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, and said nothing for almost 5 full minutes. James stood where he always stood. He waited. Do you ever feel like you're watching your own life from the outside? Edward finally said. James considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he said, mostly when things are moving too fast to actually feel them. Edward nodded slowly. Today was like that. The whole day. Birthdays can be like that. Normal birthdays or royal ones. I've only ever had normal ones, James said honestly. But I imagine royal ones come with a lot of people telling you what your life means before you've had time to figure out yourself. Edward looked up at him with an expression that was too old for his face. That's exactly what it's like. This was the nature of their conversations now. They had moved past fish and philosophy into something more direct, more personal, more honest. Edward was growing up, not in the dramatic, visible way that children grow, but in the interior way, the way that happens in the quiet parts of a person when no one is particularly watching. He was thinking about bigger things, about identity, about the gap between who he was told he was and who he actually felt like when he was alone in his room. James was the only person he talked to about this gap. It was not that his parents were unkind or distant by nature. His father, the future king, was a thoughtful man who genuinely cared about his son. His mother was warm and perceptive, but they were both carrying enormous weight, the weight of titles and history and public expectation. And when they talked to Edward, even in their private moments, there was always an undercurrent of preparation, of shaping, of gentle guidance toward the person he was going to need to be. Only James talked to him like he already was someone, not someone in progress, not a future king being built, just a person right now, exactly as he was. There came a particular week in February that tested this dynamic in a way neither of them had expected. A senior official in the palace household, a man named Director Holt, who oversaw all security and staff assignments, began a quiet internal review of guard postings. It was routine, he said, just making sure resources were properly distributed, making sure no one was too comfortable in any one position. James heard about it through the guard rotation briefings. He understood immediately what it might mean. A reassignment, a new post, a different corridor, a different door. He told himself it didn't matter. He was a professional. He went where he was assigned. That was the job. But there was something unsettling about it that he couldn't entirely set aside. What he didn't know what he had no way of knowing was that Edward had already heard about it too. Palace walls are thick, but conversations between adults tend to happen in rooms where children are assumed not to be listening. Edward had very sharp ears and a long habit of being underestimated. He had heard director Holt mention the review to one of the household managers. He had heard the phrase, excessive familiarity with royal family members, used in a tone that made his stomach drop. He had understood in an instant what it referred to, and he had felt, for the first time in his young life, a sudden and fierce protective anger on behalf of someone else. He said nothing about this to James directly. He was smart enough to know that speaking about it would only make it more visible, and visibility was exactly what James didn't need right now. Instead, Edward did something that surprised everyone who would later learn about it. He acted. He wrote a letter. Not a child's letter, full of big handwriting and round letters. A proper, composed, careful letter in the formal style he had been taught, addressed to the head of household, copied to the chief of staff, and delivered through the official internal correspondence system. In it, he noted, in language that was remarkably measured for a 10-year-old, that he had observed Guard James to be an exemplary professional who conducted his duties with exceptional discipline and discretion. He wrote that consistent posting of reliable personnel contributed positively to the sense of security and routine that supported his studies and well-being. He did not make it personal. He made it practical. He made it institutional. It was a masterclass in palace politics, written by a child who had grown up watching how those politics worked, and who had decided quietly and deliberately to use that knowledge to protect someone who had never asked to be protected. Director Holt read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he placed it in a file and marked the review of James's posting as concluded. No change recommended. James never knew about the letter until much later. For weeks, he simply noticed that the reassignment he had braced for never came, and he assumed the review had found nothing worth changing. He went back to his post. He stood where he always stood, and when Edward appeared in the corridor that Thursday evening, James greeted him with the same quiet respect he always showed. But Edward looked at him for a moment longer than usual. There was something in his expression, a private satisfaction, a small, quiet pride, that James noticed but couldn't quite read. "Good evening, Your Highness," James said. "Good evening," Edward replied. And then, after a pause, "I'm glad you're still here." James said nothing for a moment. "Then so am I." Neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted. The relationship had crossed into new territory. Not inappropriately, not recklessly, but in the way that genuine human connections do when they've been tested and held. Edward had done something real for James, not as a prince doing something for a guard, but as one person quietly choosing to protect another. And that act, invisible to almost everyone around them, had made the bond between them something neither title nor protocol could easily describe. Spring arrived, and with it came a change in Edward's schedule. He was now taking on a small number of carefully selected public engagements, brief appearances, carefully managed, designed to begin his gradual introduction to public life. He attended a school opening. He visited a children's hospital. He sat beside his father at a formal lunch and smiled and shook hands and said the right things at the right times. He came home from each of these events and, in the corridor, said something about them to James. What had actually happened versus what the reports would say. What he had felt in the hospital room when a small girl who was very sick reached up and grabbed his hand like she was holding on. What it was like to smile for a camera for 45 minutes straight and have your face start to feel like a mask. James listened to all of it. He asked careful questions. He offered observations that were practical and honest. "Does it get easier?" Edward asked once, after returning from a particularly long public day. "Being watched all the time?" "Performing." James thought about how to answer honestly. "You stop noticing the watching," he said. "But I'm not sure performing ever becomes completely natural. The best people I've known make it look easy, but I think it costs something every time." "What do the best people do with what it costs them?" "They find somewhere quiet to put it down," James said. some place or some person where they can just be themselves for a while, even just for a few minutes. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, "This is mine. This corridor." James didn't respond to that directly. There was no response that fit within the careful professional boundary he maintained. But he felt the weight of what Edward had said, and he held it with the seriousness it deserved. Because it was true. This corridor had become Edward's quiet place. And James had become, without ceremony or official recognition, something that kings and princes throughout all of history have genuinely needed and rarely been given, someone who is simply, consistently, reliably there. Not for duty's sake, not for the title, just there, in the way that really matters. There was one evening in late spring that James would think about for years afterward. It had rained all day, a heavy, steady rain that made the palace gardens dark and the windows fog at the edges. Edward had come home from a long tutoring session that had apparently not gone well. He was quiet in a way that was different from his usual thoughtful quiet. It was a heavy quiet, a discouraged one. He sat down in his usual spot against the corridor wall and didn't say anything. James let the silence sit. He had learned, by now, the difference between a silence that wanted filling and a silence that just needed company. After a long while, Edward said, "My father told me today that I have to be better than my feelings." James thought carefully. What do you think he meant by that? That a king can feel things privately, but publicly, feelings can't run the decisions. That you have to think bigger than what you personally feel in a moment. That's a hard thing to learn. He said, "You'll teach me that," Edward said. "Not you specifically." He said, "The world will teach me. Through difficulty." James nodded slowly. "He's probably right." "I know he's right," Edward said. "That's the frustrating part. I know he's right, and it still feels terrible to hear." James looked straight ahead. Knowing something is true and feeling okay about it are two completely different things. You're allowed to feel both at the same time. Edward looked up at him with that too old expression again. Most people don't say that. Most people are trying to fix the feeling. I'm just acknowledging it. Edward nodded. He sat quietly for another few minutes. Then he stood up, straightened himself, and went back into his room. When he came out the next morning, he was composed and ready and entirely himself again. The heavy quiet was gone. James never told anyone what was said in that corridor. He never repeated a word of any conversation to any colleague, any superior, any friend. The things Edward said in that corridor stayed in that corridor. That was not a rule anyone had given James. It was simply the way he was built, and it was perhaps the single most important reason Edward trusted him completely. By the time summer came, Prince Edward was no longer quite the boy who had stumbled into the corridor in planet pajamas looking for a forgotten book. He was still a child, still had that brightness and curiosity and the sharp, unexpected humor that made James suppress smiles during otherwise very serious exchanges. But he was also becoming something more, something steadier, something that would, one day, be truly ready for the weight he was being prepared to carry. And on the days when that weight felt like too much, on the days when being the future king felt less like a destiny and more like a cage, he knew exactly where to go. Out the door, down the corridor, into the cool, quiet air of that marble hallway, where a steady man stood in the same place he always stood, and simply, honestly was there. That was enough. Often, it was more than enough. It was everything. Time inside a palace moves strangely. From the outside, it looks frozen, the same rituals, the same uniforms, the same faces at the gates. But inside, years accumulate quietly, and the people who live within those walls change in ways the cameras never catch. By the time Edward was 13, he had grown several inches. His voice had begun the slow process of changing, and the tutoring sessions that had once covered basic history and mathematics had evolved into something far more serious. Constitutional law, international diplomacy, economic policy, the architecture of power. His world was getting larger and more complicated every month. James was 38 now. He had turned down 2 promotions that would have moved him to more visible postings. a decision his colleagues thought was strange, even slightly suspicious. Why would a capable, experienced guard refuse advancement? James had no good answer that he was willing to give out loud. He simply said he was content where he was, which was true as far as it went. What he didn't say was that he had come to understand, over these years, that his presence in this particular corridor was not incidental. It was necessary, not in any official capacity, not in any way that would appear in a personnel report, but necessary in the deeper sense. The sense that a compass is necessary for someone who needs to find north. He was not Edward's compass. Edward had his own remarkable internal navigation. But James was in some quiet and irreplaceable way the fixed point the young prince orientated himself by when everything else was moving. He understood this. He took it seriously, and he had the discipline, the discretion, and the genuine care to handle it the right way. The conversations by now were different. They had the depth and range that develops between people who have been talking honestly for years. Edward asked James about his childhood, not with the idle curiosity of a prince inspecting something foreign, but with genuine interest, the way you are interested in the life of someone who matters to you. James talked about growing up in a small house with loud evenings and the smell of his mother's cooking and the feeling of walking to school in the dark in winter because his town was so far north the sun barely bothered to rise properly. He talked about his father, who worked long hours and said little but showed up to every single thing James ever did. Every school play, every sports day, every small achievement. He talked about what it meant to have a parent whose love was expressed entirely through presence rather than words. Edward listened to all of this with a stillness that James had come to recognize as the sign of real attention. Not polite attention, real attention, the kind where the person is building something inside themselves from what they're hearing. "I think my father loves me that way too," Edward said one evening, after James had talked about his dad. "He doesn't say it in the way you'd expect, but he always shows up. That matters more than most people give credit for," James said. "I know. I'm starting to know." A pause. It took me a while to see it. I used to feel like he was always preparing me instead of just being with me. But I think those two things are the same for him. Preparing me is how he's with me. It's the language he speaks. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very generous way to see it." "I'm trying to be generous," Edward said, with a small, slightly tired smile. "It doesn't always come naturally, but I'm trying." This was Edward at 13, still curious, still disarmingly direct, but now also working at things. Working at patience, working at perspective, working at the slow, effortful project of becoming someone equal to what was being asked of him. It was the most honest kind of growing up, not the kind that happens to you, but the kind you choose. And James watched it happen, right there in that corridor year by year. There was a crisis that autumn that nobody outside the palace ever fully knew about. A story was beginning to circulate in certain media circles, vague, speculative, but pointed in a direction that concerned the palace household deeply. Someone had reportedly noticed the unusual frequency with which the young prince appeared to seek out a particular guard on the corridor outside his quarters. The framing being applied to this observation was not kind. It was the kind of framing that takes something clean and tries to make it look complicated, because complicated sells and clean does not. When James was quietly called into a meeting with the chief of security and a senior palace advisor, he walked in with his hands steady and his expression completely composed. He sat down. He listened to what they had to say. He was told that there was reputational sensitivity at stake. He was told that adjustments might need to be made. He was told, in the careful language that palace officials use when they are saying something difficult, that his posting might need to change. Not as a punishment, they were very clear about that, but as a precaution. James listened to all of it without interrupting. When they finished, he spoke calmly and clearly. He said that he had conducted himself with complete professionalism at all times. He said that every interaction he had ever had with the prince had been appropriate, that he had never initiated contact, never encouraged dependency, and never breached the boundary between his role and the prince's private life. He said that he was not able to prevent a child from occasionally speaking to him in a corridor, and that his job had always been to respond to the prince with respect and appropriate care. He said all of this without defensiveness, without anger, and without a single word that could be interpreted as self-pity. Then, he said, "I understand the concern. I will accept whatever decision is made." The meeting ended. James went back to his post and stood where he always stood. He said nothing to Edward about any of it. What James did not know, again, was that Edward had already been informed. His parents had spoken to him privately, carefully, in the way thoughtful parents handle sensitive things with intelligent children. They had explained the situation. They had asked Edward, gently but directly, to reflect on the nature of his relationship with the guard and whether it was something that needed to be adjusted. Edward had listened quietly. He had thought about it for a full day before responding. When he did respond, he was measured and serious in a way that made both his parents look at each other briefly over his head. That's silent communication between parents when their child says something that surprises them with its maturity. He said, "James has never been anything but professional and appropriate. He has never crossed a line. The only thing he has done is treat me like I'm a real person, and I don't think that should be something he gets punished for." He paused. "I also think if we change his posting because someone outside the palace is speculating about something that isn't true, we're letting a false narrative make decisions for us. And that seems like exactly the kind of thing I'm being taught not to do." His father looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "We won't change his posting." His mother reached over and squeezed his hand. James stayed on the corridor. When the potential media story faded, as these things often do when they are deprived of confirmation, life returned to its quiet rhythm. James stood where he stood. Edward appeared when he appeared. The conversations continued. But something had changed again in the way things change after a test. There was a new quality to the air between them, not heavier, but more conscious. Both of them knew, now, that what they had was fragile in the way that real things are fragile, that it existed inside a world that could at any moment decide it was inconvenient. And both of them, for very different reasons from very different positions, had chosen to protect it. That choice meant something. It always means something when two people from completely different worlds decide that what they have is worth the trouble. The last year James spent on that corridor was Edward's 14th. By then, Edward was doing regular formal public engagements, handling his own correspondence with guidance, and sitting in on certain briefings that most 14-year-olds in the world would find completely incomprehensible. He was, in every visible sense, becoming the person his position required. Confident without arrogance, thoughtful without being slow, warm in public without being naive about what public warmth costs. In private, in the corridor, he was still Edward, still the boy who had asked about fish in the water, still the person who could sit in comfortable silence better than almost anyone James had ever met, still capable of saying something in 3 words that most people couldn't say in 30. James was reassigned in November of that year, not as a punishment, not as a result of any controversy, but simply because the natural rotation of palace security brought new assignments. He was posted to the East Wing, a different corridor, different duties, different rhythms. A good posting, his supervisor said. An important one. His last night on the corridor outside Edward's room. He stood in his usual place for his usual shift. Toward the end of the evening, Edward came out. He was in his school clothes, a book under his arm, and he stood a few feet away from James in the way he had always stood. Not too close, never crossing that careful line, but near enough for the conversation to be easy. They stood there for a while without speaking. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere deep in the palace, a clock ticked. Then Edward said, "I heard about the reassignment." "Yes, Your Highness. It's a good posting. East Wing. So I've been told." Another silence. Edward looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I want to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without making it formal." James paused. Then, carefully, he said, "Go ahead. You have been the most honest person in this building for as long as I can remember. You never told me what I wanted to hear. You never treated me like a title. You just talked to me. Like it mattered what I thought. Like I was already someone worth taking seriously. He stopped, took a breath. I don't know what I would have been like without this corridor. I think I might have disappeared into the performance of being a prince and never quite found the real part underneath. You kept the real part alive. I don't know if you understand how much that is. James said nothing for a long moment. The professional discipline that had always kept him composed was doing its job, but it was working harder than usual. Then, he said, "You kept it alive yourself." I just stood here. Edward smiled. The real one, not the public one. You stood here every single day. Do you know how rare that is? Someone who just stays. Who's just there, reliably, without asking for anything. James nodded once, slowly. I know. They stood quietly for a moment longer. Then, Edward said, I hope wherever you're posted next, the people there understand what they've got. I'll be fine, James said. I always am. Edward nodded. He looked at James one more time, that direct, unguarded look that he had been giving him since he was 9 years old in planet pajamas. Then, he went back into his room. The door clicked shut. James stood in the corridor for another 2 hours until his shift ended. He stood exactly where he always stood. He looked straight ahead. His face was composed, and his posture was correct, and from the outside, he looked exactly like a palace guard doing his job. But inside, quietly, in the part of himself where things that really matter get stored carefully, he understood that this posting, this corridor, these years had been the most important assignment of his professional life. Not because of its visibility, not because of its prestige, but because of what had been built here invisibly over years of honest conversation and quiet presence and mutual trust. A future king had grown up in part because someone had simply chosen every single day to be genuinely, steadily there. And a guard from a small town had learned something that no training program had ever taught him. That sometimes the most important thing you can do in any position, at any level, is to be the kind of person someone can trust completely. Not for what you do in the moments that matter publicly, but for what you are in all the quiet moments in between. Years passed. Edward continued growing into his role. The public saw a young man who was thoughtful and composed and surprisingly real in the way that the best royal figures managed to be. People noticed something about him that was hard to name exactly. He had a quality of genuineness that felt rare in positions like his. He listened when people talked to him, really listened, not in the practiced way, but in the way that makes a person feel actually heard. He had a steadiness that didn't come from pretending nothing was difficult, but from having learned, somewhere along the way, to sit with difficulty without being destroyed by it. People called it character. They speculated about his upbringing, his education, his parents' influence. They wrote articles and gave interviews and offered their expert analysis of how this particular prince had developed into this particular kind of person. None of them mentioned the corridor. None of them knew about it. None of them could have guessed that somewhere inside the most important years of a future king's formation, in the cold quiet of a marble hallway very late at night, a steady and honest man had simply stood where he was supposed to stand and listened and answered and stayed. And that had been enough to change everything. This is not a story about crowns or power or the grand machinery of royal life. It is a story about what human beings need from each other, which is never as complicated as we make it and never as easy as we wish it was. We need someone to talk to honestly. We need someone who will still be there tomorrow. We need someone who treats us like we already are who we're trying to become. A guard gave a prince those things. A prince, in return, gave a guard something equally rare. The knowledge that his quiet, consistent, unrecognized presence had mattered. That standing in the same place every day and being exactly who he was had shaped something important. Most people go their whole lives without knowing that. James knew it. And that knowledge lived in him long after the corridors changed and the years moved on and the boy in the planet pajamas became a man who would one day stand before a nation and be called king. In the corridor where it all began, the floors are still cold marble. The lighting is still that same pale gold. A new guard stands outside the door now. Young, professional, doing the job exactly right. Somewhere in the palace, the future king carries the weight of everything that is coming. And somewhere in that weight, steady and invisible as the foundation of a building, is the shape of all those quiet conversations. The questions about fish, the silences that needed company, the honest words that nobody else had been willing to say. Trust built slowly, honestly, over years in the quiet. That is what this story is about. That is what it was always about.